Before the airplane, before the tank, before the radio, before any of the technologies that define modern warfare in the popular imagination, there was the military train. And it changed war more completely, more permanently, and more invisibly than almost any weapon ever invented. Not because it carried weapons, though it did. Not because it moved troops, though it moved millions of them. But because it changed the fundamental arithmetic of war, the relationship between distance, time, and the will to fight in ways that generals are still calculating today. The year is 1862. The American Civil War has been raging for a year. In the state of Virginia, the Union Army is struggling with a problem that every army in human history had faced and none had fully solved. How to keep a large fighting force supplied across a distance. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, replacement equipment. The larger an army, the more it consumes. And the more it consumes, the more it depends on the supply chain behind it. For most of history, that supply chain moved at the speed of a walking ox pulling a wagon. The Civil War introduced something new. Trains. And the army that understood trains better, that built more track, protected existing lines more aggressively, and thought about the railroad not as a convenience, but as a weapon, was going to win. The United States Military Railroad was not a metaphor. It was a literal organization, an arm of the Union Army with its own commander, its own engineers, its own construction crews, and its own mandate to keep iron moving at any cost. At its peak, the USMRR operated over 2,000 miles of track and a fleet of locomotives and cars that could move an entire Army Corps, tens of thousands of men with their artillery and supplies faster than any force in history had ever moved. When Confederate raiders destroyed a section of track, USMRR crews rebuilt it within hours. The famous Potomac Creek Bridge, 400 feet long, 100 feet high, was rebuilt in 9 days using only hand tools and timber cut from the surrounding forest. President Lincoln, upon seeing it, called it a beanpole and cornstalks bridge. It held the weight of military locomotives without incident. The man who understood the military railway better than anyone in the Civil War era was not a general. He was a railroad superintendent from Ohio named Herman Haupt. Haupt was brilliant in the particular way that systems thinkers are brilliant. He could look at a railway network the way a chess player looks at a board, seeing not just the current position, but the 10 moves that would follow from every decision. He understood that the train was only as powerful as its weakest link, that a single destroyed bridge, a single captured locomotive, a single section of torn up track could halt an entire army's advance as effectively as a military defeat. And he built the USMRR around that understanding, creating a system so robust and so quickly repairable that Confederate forces eventually concluded that destroying Union rail lines was largely futile.
But the Civil War was only the beginning. The lesson that the American conflict taught, that railways were not just transportation, but strategic weapons, was absorbed by military planners across Europe with an attention that bordered on obsession. Prussia, in particular, understood. The Prussian military under Helmuth von Moltke the Elder had been studying American railway logistics since the 1850s, and when the opportunity came to test those lessons in the wars of German unification, von Moltke used the Prussian railway network with a precision that his opponents, Austria in 1866, France in 1870, simply could not match. In the Franco-Prussian War, Prussia moved 380,000 troops to the French border in 18 days. France, with a larger and more established railway network, managed to move its forces with such chaos and confusion that units arrived at the wrong stations without their equipment, unable to find their commands. The war was decided, in significant part, by who understood the railway better. There is a concept in military strategy called the culminating point, the moment at which an advancing force has extended itself so far from its supply base that it can no longer sustain offensive operations and must stop or begin to retreat. Napoleon understood this concept better than almost any commander in history, and yet he was destroyed by it twice, in Spain and in Russia, because his army moved faster than its supply chain could follow. The military railway solved, or appeared to solve, the culminating point problem. As long as the tracks behind an advancing army remained intact and rolling stock remained available, the supply chain could keep pace with the advance. the army could, in theory, advance indefinitely. This was not entirely true, as every 20th century war would demonstrate, but it was true enough to transform every calculation that military planners made about the relationship between speed, distance, and supply. World War I was, in its logistics, a railway war. The famous Schlieffen Plan, Germany's strategy for a two-front war against France and Russia, was built around the railway timetable. The plan required the German army to mobilize, concentrate, and move through Belgium into France on a schedule so precise that it had to be measured in hours, not days. Once the mobilization orders were issued and the trains began to move, the plan could not be stopped or significantly altered without catastrophic disruption to the entire military machine. This is the dark side of the military railway. It did not just enable speed, it imposed speed. It locked nations into schedules that left no room for the kind of political negotiation that might have avoided the catastrophe of 1914. The train timetables of August 1914 helped drag Europe into a war that none of its major leaders fully wanted, and none of them could stop once the engine started moving. The Western Front of World War I was, among other things, the largest railway construction project in history to that point. Both sides built hundreds of miles of light, narrow-gauge railway, field railways running right up to the front lines to move supplies the last few kilometers from the main line railheads to the trenches. The narrow-gauge military railway is one of the least discussed technologies of the Great War, and one of the most important. Without it, the logistics of sustained trench warfare, which consumed artillery shells in quantities that no previous war had imagined possible, would have been simply impossible. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 fired 4 million shells in the week before the infantry assault. Every one of those shells traveled part of its journey on a military railway. Let us talk about a specific train that most people have never heard of. The German Paris gun, the Krupp Lang Max, later known as the Paris Geschütz, was a railway gun, not a gun transported by railway. A gun that was mounted on a railway car and could only be fired from a railway-mounted platform because its barrel was so long and its recoil so violent that no fixed emplacement could absorb it. In March 1918, this weapon fired shells from a distance of over 120 kilometers into Paris, further than any artillery piece had ever fired in history. The shells took 3 minutes to travel from gun to target, reaching an altitude of 40 kilometers at the peak of their trajectory, briefly entering the stratosphere. The gun was a railway gun, and without the railway, it could not exist. The railway was not the delivery system for the weapon. The railway was the weapon.
In the Pacific theater of World War II, the military railway acquired an additional dimension of horror with the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, the Death Railway. Built between 1942 and 1943 by the Imperial Japanese Army using approximately 180,000 Asian laborers and 60,000 Allied prisoners of war, the railway was intended to supply Japanese forces in Burma without exposure to Allied naval interdiction of sea routes. The human cost was catastrophic. Approximately 100,000 Asian laborers and 12,000 Allied prisoners of war died during construction from disease, starvation, overwork, and deliberate brutality. The railway was completed. It was used briefly. It was then largely destroyed by Allied bombing. The military logic that built it, the calculation that the supply line was worth any cost in human life, is one of the most extreme expressions of the railway's place in military thinking. So important that it justified what no ethical calculation could ever justify. The Soviet Union in World War II developed what may be the most sophisticated military railway operation in history. The sheer scale of the Eastern Front, thousands of kilometers of front line, across a continent, in conditions of extreme cold and terrain that defeated conventional logistics, required a railway system of extraordinary flexibility and resilience. The Soviet railway gauge, wider than the European standard gauge, was initially a disadvantage when Germany invaded because captured Soviet track could not be used by German rolling stock without regaging. But it became an advantage when the tide turned because advancing Soviet forces could use their own rolling stock on Soviet gauge track that the retreating Germans had not managed to destroy. The railway gauge, a measurement made in the 19th century for entirely non-military reasons, became a strategic factor that shaped the outcome of the largest land war in history. There is a lesser-known chapter of military railway history that belongs to Asia, and specifically to Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. The Dutch colonial railway network in Java was designed for economic extraction, as we have discussed in other contexts. But when the Japanese invasion came in 1942, those same railways were immediately converted to military use. Japanese forces used the Javanese railway network to move troops and supplies across the island with a speed that the Dutch defenders, who had not fully thought through the military implications of their own infrastructure, could not match. The railway that the Dutch built to carry sugar and coffee to the port became the railway that carried the force that ended Dutch rule. Infrastructure once built does not take sides. After World War II, the military railway entered a new phase that might be called strategic concealment. The Soviet Union, during the Cold War, developed a program of railway-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, the RT-2PM-2 topol-M system, which could be mounted on railway cars and moved continuously along the Soviet rail network, making them almost impossible to target in a nuclear first strike. A missile that is always moving, that could be anywhere in a network spanning 11 time zones, is a missile that cannot be destroyed before it is launched. The railway, which began as a way to move armies faster, had become a way to make the ultimate weapon of mass destruction effectively invisible. The locomotive that once pulled artillery shells to the Western Front was now, in its conceptual descendants, pulling nuclear warheads through the Siberian night. The military train is not history. In the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, railways have played a role that analysts are still fully assessing. Ukraine's broad gauge railway network, the same gauge as the Soviet system, distinct from European standard gauge, has been a critical factor in the logistics of Ukrainian defense. Weapon shipments from NATO countries arriving at the Polish border must be transferred to Ukrainian gauge rolling stock before they can move east. The railway junctions where this transfer happens have become strategic targets, and the Ukrainian state railway, Ukrzaliznytsia, has continued to operate under bombardment with a resilience and organizational discipline that echoes across 80 years the USMRR crews who rebuilt the Potomac Creek Bridge in 9 days. Some things about the military railway do not change. What does the military train teach us about the relationship between technology and war? It teaches us that the most powerful weapons are not always the ones that kill. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one that moves. The capacity to project force across distance, to appear in strength where the enemy did not expect strength to appear, has decided more battles and more wars than any single weapon. The railway gave that capacity to the industrial age in a form that previous centuries could not have imagined. And the conflicts of the industrial age, the American Civil War, the wars of German unification, the First and Second World Wars, the Cold War, the wars of the 21st century, were all shaped in ways both visible and invisible by the iron road and the engine that moved along it. The military train is a mirror held up to the civilization that built it. It reflects our organizational capacity, the ability to coordinate thousands of people and machines in service of a common purpose. It reflects our engineering ambition, the willingness to build and rebuild under conditions that would make construction in peacetime seem leisurely. And it reflects our darkness, the readiness to treat human beings as freight, to calculate lives as logistics, to build railways across mountains using bodies as the primary construction material. The train does not judge what it carries, it moves what it is given. The judgment belongs to the people who load it and the people who ordered the loading. The Iron Road is neutral, history is not. If you have ever stood at a railway station and watched a long train pass and felt something move in your chest that you could not name, a feeling that is partly wonder and partly something older, something that recognizes in the movement of enormous mass across distance a power that is simultaneously thrilling and sobering, then you have felt, without knowing it, an echo of what every general since 1862 has felt when they looked at a railway map and understood what was possible. The train moves, the world changes, and the question of what we pointed toward and what we load into its cars remains the most important question of every age that has had the privilege and the burden of possessing it. Subscribe if this kind of thinking reaches you, and tell me in the comments, what was the military train in your life? What moved something enormous in a direction that changed everything?